Montana Territory, June 1878. They said the sun never fully rose on Larkspur Grove after her husband died, and folks in town never let her forget it. Liora Gaines stepped down from the wagon with her jaw tight and her shoulders set like stone. The wind tugged at her black skirts as she scanned the broken fence line and the sagging roof of the ranch house she had not seen in nearly a year. The land was hers now, what was left of it. Her husband, Nathaniel, had been crushed beneath a faulty timber just 3 months after they married, and ever since, folks had whispered her name like it carried a curse. Bad luck, they called her behind her back. She did not care. She had not come back for them. She had come for her son. "Nola, stay close to the wagon," she called over her shoulder. The little girl, not quite 5, darted around the wheel with a laugh, her dark curls bouncing. Across the seat, her younger brother, Noble, sat wide-eyed and quiet, clutching a chipped wooden horse. Liora reached up and touched the small of his back, just for a moment. "We're home now," she said softly. Home. It was nothing like she remembered. The barn was half collapsed, the fields overgrown. The man her late husband had trusted to lease the land in her absence had fled months ago without a word, and with him, the last of the coin she had sent. She stood staring at the mess until her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "You are a Gaines," she whispered to herself. "And you will not fall apart." She set to work that day, boarding up windows, clearing out the animal pens, stacking wood. She worked until her hands bled. The next morning, she saddled the mule and rode into town for supplies. She felt the eyes before she saw them. "Did you hear she came back? Poor children. 3 men dead around her in 2 years. I would not stand too close." Liora kept her chin high and moved through the general store with a list in her hand and her pride in her spine. It was on her way back to the ranch that everything changed. The storm rolled in fast from the west, swallowing the sun behind thick black clouds. She had just crossed the creek when the sky split open. The rain came hard and cold, and the mule reared, nearly throwing her. She would have managed fine if not for the wheel. A loud crack shot through the air, and the wagon behind her pitched violently to one side. She leapt off the saddle and ran back. The wheel had snapped clean off. Nola began to cry. Noble clung to her leg, silent but frightened. Liora dropped to her knees in the mud, trying to calm them, trying to think. They were miles from town, the storm only growing worse, and there was no one nearby. Or so she thought. A horse's hooves broke through the downpour, fast and sure. "Whoa!" came a low voice. She turned her head and saw a tall man dismounting just feet away. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long duster soaked through with rain. His horse was steady beside him, a strong chestnut with alert eyes. "You all right?" he asked, moving closer. She stepped in front of the children instinctively, hand on the small knife at her belt. The man raised both hands. "I mean no harm. Just saw the busted wagon." Liora nodded once. "Wheels gone. We can walk." He looked at the 2 children behind her. "Not in this storm, you cannot." She hesitated. "I live 2 miles up," he added. "You can wait it out in my barn. Dry clothes, a fire. That is all." Still she paused. "I am Xalen Everett," he said, voice steady. "I run cattle west of here. That is all I am." She studied him. His face was roughened by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind, clear, and steady like a man with nothing to prove. Liora gave a slow nod. He moved fast after that, loading the children onto his horse, helping her with the mule, guiding them through the storm. By the time they reached his barn, the rain had turned to sleet. Xalen lifted Nola down with care, then helped Liora through the doors. Inside, it was warm and dry, the hay stacked high, and the air rich with the scent of horses. He built a fire while Liora wrapped the children in blankets and dried their hair. "Thank you," she said after a while, when the children had fallen asleep curled together in the straw. Xalen sat across from her, his coat draped over a beam to dry. "Most folks would have passed you by." "I know. Her voice was quiet. They think I bring death. He looked at her, then not quick, not pitying, just steady. You brought 2 children into the world. That is not death, Liora. Her breath hitched at the sound of her name spoken soft like that. She looked away, heart pounding in a way it had not in years. I should not have accepted help, she muttered. It always costs more than it gives. You can fix your wagon tomorrow, he said. No cost. I have spare wheels. She blinked. Why? Because you looked like you were about to break, he said simply. And I have broken before. I know what it looks like. Silence stretched between them, thick but not uncomfortable. You have children? She asked. He shook his head. No wife. No one waiting. She nodded. His eyes lingered on her face for a long moment. But I would have wanted them, he said. A family. Liora looked down at her hands, rough and torn from work. I had a husband. He was good. But he died before we had a chance to build anything real. Xalen's voice was low. You are still building, Liora. You came back. That counts for something. She did not know what to say. So she just watched the fire. He stood not long after. There is a loft upstairs. Dry hay. You can sleep there with the children. She nodded, rising slowly. Before she climbed the ladder, she turned to him. You said you saw me about to break? Xalen looked up at her. Yes. Then thank you, she said, for not letting me. His expression softened. Any time. That night, as she lay with her children curled against her, Liora stared at the wooden beams above her head, the storm now just a whisper outside. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something like safety. Something like hope. She did not know it yet, but they would call her bad luck for the last time. Because what she and that cowboy were about to find was true fortune. By morning, the storm had wrung itself out, leaving the prairie hushed and silvered beneath a low mist. The barn door stood cracked open where Xalen had stepped out at first light. Liora found him near the corral, sleeves rolled and a fencing tool slung across his shoulder. He was hammering in a new post, his movements methodical, quiet. I can mend the wheel today, he said without looking up. If you've a mind to head back. She tightened the shawl around her shoulders. Children still sleep. I'll come help. He paused, then nodded once. There's coffee in the pot inside. You're welcome to it. Liora hesitated, then crossed the yard, boots dampening the dew-heavy grass. The farmhouse was modest, pressed low against the earth like it meant to endure. Inside, the warmth hit her first wood smoke and something faintly sweet. A kettle hissed over the stove, and beside it, a tin plate held 3 honey biscuits wrapped in cloth. She stared at them a moment. When Xalen stepped in behind her, he said, They're from Mrs. Curran. She lives east near the bluff. Brings them by when she's got too many. Liora poured 2 cups and passed one to him. You're close with your neighbors? He leaned against the doorframe, sipping. We help one another when we can. Not close, just decent. There's a difference. She nodded slowly. I've known the other kind. They sat without speaking for some time, the quiet stretching easy between them. Then Xalen set his cup aside and asked, You planning to stay on that land? I am. Won't be easy. I didn't expect it to be. He studied her profile, then looked away toward the window where the fog was beginning to lift. I've a spare plow blade near new. Yours is rusted out. That's not charity, she said, eyes narrowing. No. It's a favor. You'll owe me supper. She exhaled through a short laugh. I can manage that. They returned to the barn together. Noble was awake, pulling hay through his fingers, while Nola still dreamed under the quilt. Liora knelt and smoothed her son's hair. You hungry? He nodded, solemn-eyed. Xalen crouched nearby. I've eggs and milk. I'll see to the meal while you fix breakfast. Liora watched him tie an apron of canvas around his waist and lead the animal out. She'd never known a man who moved so quiet around children, who offered help and waited nothing in return. They stayed through the morning, then the afternoon, Liora working beside him to fit the wheel, her hands steady on the iron rim. Xalen didn't speak unless something needed saying. He taught her how to brace the axle with a thick branch and pack the joint with grease to keep it from seizing. She listened, learning with the same quiet resolve she used to fend off town gossip. As the sun thinned across the horizon, Liora loaded the children into the wagon. Nola held a biscuit in her lap, humming softly. "You'll make it back before night," Xalen said, tightening the last bolt. "I can come back tomorrow," she offered, surprising herself. "To bring the plow blade." He nodded once, brushing dust from his trousers. "If you like." She gathered the reins, then paused. "You have a kind way with them," she said, tilting her head toward the children. He met her gaze. "They're good. And they've got you." Her hands stilled on the leather. "That hasn't always been enough. It is now." She looked away quickly, but not before he saw the way her jaw shifted, as if holding something back. She clicked the mule forward. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had turned lavender, and the earth smelled of damp sage. She laid the children down on the straw mattress and sat for a long time beside them, listening to their breathing, hands folded in her lap. Her body ached from the day's work, but it was the kind of ache that left her feeling solid, like she belonged to the ground beneath her. The next morning, she returned to Xalen's with the borrowed plow blade balanced across the wagon floor. He met her at the gate, eyes flicking to the children, then to her hands at the reins. "I've coffee on," he said. "I brought stew." They shared the meal in the open air, seated on overturned pails beneath an elm tree. The children picked wildflowers in the grass nearby, and neither adult mentioned the past, nor asked about the future. But when Liora stood to leave, Xalen touched the edge of her sleeve. Not enough to stop her. Just enough to be felt. "You ever need help?" he said. "You come." She didn't answer right away. Then, with a slow nod, "I will." And she meant it. By late July, the land had begun to change. The creek behind Leora's ranch ran stronger from the summer rains, and the grass in the east pasture came in thick enough for grazing. She cleared it herself with a borrowed scythe, her palms blistering under the worn handle. Noble helped stack the cuttings into bundles, his small arms determined. Nola gathered wild mint along the fence posts, tucking it into her apron to dry later for tea. They no longer kept solely to their own place. Xalen had come by twice in the past week, once to mend a latch on her grain bin, once to bring a spare harness when hers cracked at the buckle. Each time, he left with no more than a nod and a glance toward the children. Each time, she watched him ride off until he disappeared behind the cottonwoods. On the third visit, he brought a folded map and a pair of canvas gloves. "There's a spring on the northwest ridge," he told her, laying the paper flat across her table. "If you set troughs there, you can keep a few head of cattle." She leaned over it, eyes scanning the drawn lines. "I can't afford cattle. I didn't say now. I said if." She traced the pencil-marked creek bed with one finger. "That ridge is rocky. Won't be easy clearing a path. I can help." She looked up sharply. "You have your own land." He shrugged, one shoulder lifting beneath his faded shirt. "That spring's too close to run dry. Would be a shame not to use it." She folded the map slowly. "If I say yes, I want it clear you're not doing this out of pity." "I don't pity you, Liora. I respect you." She stood still for a moment, fingers tightening around the map's edge, then said, "You can come by Saturday. We'll walk the ridge." That Saturday, Noble stayed with the widow Halpern, who lived a half-mile east and had taken a liking to the boy's quiet nature. Nola rode in the wagon, curled against a flour sack, while Liora and Xalen walked the slope above the creek. The ridge was steeper than it looked from below. Loose shale crunched under their boots, and the sun beat down without mercy. Xalen carried a length of rope and a hand axe, and when Liora stumbled on a patch of thistle, he caught her by the elbow and steadied her. They didn't speak for a while. The climb left no breath for words. When they reached the top, the wind cooled their faces, and the prairie rolled out before them, golden and endless. Xalen pointed to a cluster of scrub oak. Spring's just past that rise. She nodded, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. You always know where water hides. If you've lived off the same land long enough, you learn where it carries life. She turned to face him. Is that how you live, Xalen? Off the land? I live with it. There's a difference. Liora crouched near a patch of sagebrush, running her hand along the dry soil. I never knew how to read ground like this. Nathaniel handled the ranching. I did the rest. He knelt beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. You're learning fast. Because I have to. Not because I want to. His voice softened. That doesn't make what you're doing any less strong. She looked down at her hands, dirt under every nail. Strong wasn't ever something I aimed for. I just didn't want to disappear. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then took it, letting him pull her to her feet. They walked the rest of the ridge in silence, stopping only once to mark a spot with a piece of tied cloth where the slope dipped and the soil turned dark with moisture. At the bottom of the hill, Nola slept still, wrapped in a shawl, her thumb tucked beneath her chin. Xalen reached over and adjusted the brim of her hat to shade her eyes. Liora saw the gesture and asked quietly, You ever think about leaving this place? He rested one hand on the wagon's edge. I did. Once. Right after my brother passed. Thought maybe I'd head south, start fresh. What stopped you? My horse came up lame. Couldn't sell him in that state. And by the time he healed, I figured maybe staying wasn't so bad. She gave a small nod. Sometimes the land decides for us. He looked at her, long and steady. Sometimes it does. When they returned to her ranch, the sky had turned a pale orange at the edges. Xalen helped lift Nola down, her arms wrapped around his neck with the easy trust of a child who'd known no harm from him. Liora watched them, her mouth drawn but her eyes soft. He set the girl gently on the porch, then stepped back, hands at his sides. I'll come by next week with that second trough. She nodded. You'll stay for supper this time. His brow lifted slightly. That a request? It's a decision, she said. He gave her a quiet nod, then turned toward his horse. When he rode off, Liora stood there for a long time, watching the dust rise and settle in his wake. Inside, Noble sat at the table with a carved stick and a length of twine. Mama? Yes? Is he gonna help us more? She smoothed a braid from Nola's forehead. He might. The boy looked up. I think he's kind. So do I. She didn't say anything more, but later, once the children were asleep and the lamp burned low, she took out the map and ran her fingers over the ridge line. Then, with a small piece of charcoal, she marked a new trail along the edge. Not the way Nathaniel would have drawn it. A way of her own. The morning after Xalen set the second trough, a letter arrived by stage from Helena. Liora found it tucked beneath her flour sack on the porch, sealed with a wax stamp she didn't recognize. She broke it open carefully, her fingers stiff from hauling fence posts the day before. Inside, the words were tight and formal. A lawyer, a man named Wendell, wrote to inform her that a distant uncle of Nathaniel's had passed, leaving behind a modest herd and a parcel of scrubland near Stillwater. The estate had named her and the children as legal heirs. She stared at the page for a long moment, then folded it and slid it into her apron pocket. She didn't yet know what it meant, only that it felt like the first time something had come her way that hadn't been taken just as quickly. Later that afternoon, she walked the slope above the troughs while Noble napped and Nola played with a length of string near the porch. Xalen was already there, kneeling beside the spring runoff, testing the flow with his palm. You always find the quiet places, she said from behind him. He stood slowly. They don't ask much of a man. She joined him at the water's edge, boots sinking slightly in the softened ground. A letter came. Land near Stillwater. Not much, but it's ours. He nodded, glancing at her sidelong. You going to take it? I don't know yet. Might sell it if the price is fair. Could lease it to someone local. Keep a stake in it. I'd have to trust someone again. He waited a beat. You trust me? I'm learning to. They walked the fence line together without speaking. The wind had changed, carrying the scent of pine and the faintest hint of wood smoke from far off. When they reached the final post, Liora leaned against it and took a slow breath. Do you ever miss what you didn't have? She asked. Xalen crossed his arms over his chest. I used to. And now? I've stopped looking backward. Took me years to learn how. She turned her face toward the sky. People still cross the road when I'm in town. He didn't respond at first. Then, let them. That easy? No. But it's not your burden to carry what they decided to believe. She closed her eyes a moment. I looked at the grave yesterday. Nathaniel's. The grass has grown tall around it. I didn't feel sorrow. You shouldn't feel guilty for surviving. I don't. I just don't know what to do with the space he left. Maybe it's not meant to stay empty. Her eyes opened slowly. And what would you put there? He didn't answer right away. He studied the slope behind her, where the wind moved through the grass like a hand smoothing cloth, and then he said, something steady. Something earned. They didn't move for a long while. Just stood there, side by side, the fence between them and the open prairie. That evening, she brought out the last of the preserves she'd kept from the year before and ladled them over cornbread, serving it with salt pork and beans. Xalen ate slowly, his hands always moving with care around the children. Noble asked him about the ridge trail, and Nola insisted he try her pressed leaf drawing. He held it like it was something rare, nodding with solemn approval. After the meal, Liora stepped outside while the children washed up with a tin basin on the porch. The stars were just beginning to show, pale and uncertain. Xalen joined her after a moment, rolling his sleeves to his elbows. I've seen you look worn to the bone, he said quietly. But not tonight. I'm not worn, she said. I'm thinking. About Stillwater? About what to build. And who I might build it with. He didn't move. You already know my answer. I do, she said. Then, turning to face him fully. But I needed to know mine. The air between them held quiet and something heavier weighty, not with sorrow, but with decision. I want you to stay, she said softly. Not just for supper. For what comes after. Xalen looked at her, and for the first time, there was no guardedness in him. Only a steady kind of promise. I've been here, he said, waiting for the right thing to grow roots. Liora didn't speak. She stepped forward instead, rested her hand against his chest where his heartbeat was strong and even. His hand covered hers, warm and sure. Behind them, the children's laughter drifted out like wind chimes in a soft breeze. And under that Montana sky, neither of them looked away. The wind that came down from the divide in early August tasted of pine and dry stone, a sure sign the heat had turned. Liora stood at the south fence line with a hammer in her hand and a half-driven nail clenched between her teeth. Behind her, Noble's voice rose and fell from the garden rows, retelling some story Xalen had told him about a one-eyed mule and a runaway cart. Nola was beside him, humming tunelessly as she twisted twine into a crown of grass and sunflower stems. Xalen was due by sundown. He had spent the week in the hills helping a neighbor track down a calf that had gone off into the ravine country. Liora hadn't seen him since the Sunday before, but his coat still hung by her door, and his hand axe leaned against the porch rail, as if either one of them had ever truly left. She drove the final nail and stepped back, rubbing the sweat from her brow with the hem of her sleeve. The fence was straight, the posts tight. She had done it herself. Not because she preferred solitude, but because she wanted to know she could. Later, after the sun dipped behind the hills and the light turned amber, Xalen rode into the yard slow, his horse trailing a second behind him. This one's for Noble, he said, swinging down. Found her tied up in a canyon, half-starved but steady on her feet. Doesn't spook easy. Noble let out a sound halfway between awe and disbelief. She's mine? She is, Xalen said. If you learn to ride her proper. Liora stepped off the porch with the basin in her hands. That's a fine gift. It's not a gift, Xalen said, brushing dust from his sleeves. It's an exchange. He helps me clear brush before the frost, and she's his. Noble nodded fiercely. I'll do it. I'll work hard. You already do, Xalen said. They ate supper outside on a blanket spread across the grass. The stew was thin but seasoned well, and Nola dozed against Leora's leg before the bowls were emptied. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the air was soft with the hum of crickets. Xalen watched the children quietly, then turned to Liora. I've been thinking about winter. She set down her tin cup. What about it? Harder to get out here when the snow sets in. I'd rather not be a visitor when it comes. She searched his face. You want to stay? I already have, he said. Just not officially. Not with a roof over my head. Liora didn't rush her answer. She looked out over the slope, where the moon painted the troughs in silver, and then back to him. There's still work to do on the house. The floorboards in the back room are soft. I know how to fix them. You'd be sharing space with 2 children. I already care about both, he said. She reached for his hand then, fingers wrapping around his with a quiet certainty. Then stay. Not as a guest. As part of this. He didn't speak. He just leaned forward, pressing his lips to hers with a warmth that settled every restless part of her. The kiss was slow, grounded, filled with the kind of trust they had built step by step, not rushed or taken, but offered. When they parted, she whispered against his cheek. I want this life with you. Then it's yours, he said. Fully. By mid-September, the back room had been rebuilt, the stove cleaned and resealed, and Xalen's saddle hung beside Nathaniel's old one in the barn with no ceremony, just a quiet acceptance of what had come before and what was here now. They married in late October, beneath the cottonwoods that framed the creek. Mrs. Curran brought a pie, and the widow Halpern stitched Nola a new dress from flour sacks and blue calico scraps. Noble wore a shirt Xalen had hemmed himself, the stitches uneven but proud. There were no vows beyond what they said to each other beneath the sky. I'll build with you, Liora told him, voice steady. Every day. With my hands, my heart, and my word. And I'll stand beside you, Xalen said. No matter what the land gives or takes. The children stood between them, hands clasped, and the wind rustled through the trees like a blessing. They built the rest of the life slowly, but with care. Xalen taught Noble to track deer prints in snow, and how to mend tack with knotted sinew. Liora showed Nola how to gather herbs before the frost, and boil them down for medicine. They planted winter wheat, and when spring came again, they added chickens to the barn and hung a new bell from the porch beam. They didn't speak often of what had come before. Not because it was forgotten, but because what they had now didn't need to erase it. Each night, Xalen placed his tools near the hearth and sat beside Liora, her head tucked beneath his chin as she stitched or read aloud from the worn pages of a borrowed book. And when the world outside turned cruel with wind or silence, the home they made stood quiet and sure, a place where no one crossed the road to avoid them, where hands were held without fear, and where love was not spoken in grand words, but in the small, steady acts that filled every shared day. They never left Larkspur Grove. They didn't need to. Everything they'd ever wanted had taken root right there, in the dirt and the dust and the slow, unshakable bond between a woman who had survived every loss and a man who had waited for something worth staying for. And together, they were never alone again.